We interviewed Daniel Simon from Dorman Products in episode 181. He's a returning guest. He's been on the show several times. But that specific episode, 181, we talked about DEF supply modules. And the response to that interview was huge. It's one of the most listened to episodes in the history of our show. Our TikTok video alone got over 50,000 views. How awesome is that? But some of the responses were, I guess we could say, from a wide spectrum of responses, from positive to people very adamant about their feelings about diesel emission systems in general. And Daniel and I, when we reviewed some of the comments that people were making, we kind of saw three myths emerge from that you could kind of put into three separate buckets. And we wanted to address those specifically today. So Daniel, welcome back to the Heavy Duty Parts Report. Today you are hailing from Brazil. So this is probably the farthest away I've ever had a guest recording a podcast interview. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me again, Jamie. Always a pleasure to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about the response that we got to your last time on the show. First of all, huge response from the trucking industry.
Yeah, it's really no surprise to me, right? The diesel emission systems, how do I put this lightly, generate some strong feelings. Yes. We don't mandate them. We don't design them. We didn't build the trucks the way they are. We're out there trying to make available aftermarket replacement parts to try to make that repair easier. But I think there's no question from, about 2003, really 2007 on, these mandated emissions control systems certainly do generate a ton of strong feelings.
Yeah. And I mean, in episode 181, we were even talking about a remanufactured product that you're bringing to market. So it's like, you're not even designing that product. You're just remanufacturing it and trying to enhance it and make it work better for people. So let's get right into it. Myth number one, diesel emission systems are a government-sponsored cash grab and they don't work on purpose. Now, where did we get that myth from? Let me just read you some of the comments. So just another Karen 2020 says, what's the main purpose of DEF? And this was an honest question. It wasn't meant to be kind of derogatory in any way. It was like, I really don't get it. So I think that kind of is surprising to me, but then there are people out there who still don't seem to fully understand the systems. CJ says it's a cash grab. That's why, in response to just another Karen 2020's question. Manny Singh says DEF, a product forced on truckers and is responsible for 75% of the repairs in a truck. Malcolm Farrell 935, best DEF system is the one in the dumpster behind the shop. So, people are not happy about these systems, and there's this feeling that, like I said, it's just a government-sponsored cash grab, and they don't work, and that's on purpose. What are your thoughts to this feedback that we get?
Yeah, so maybe take that sort of in two directions here. So, one, in terms of a government cash grab, right? So, the emissions control, to be clear here, maybe to clarify one myth here. The emissions controls, when the EPA and they wrote this from the Clean Air Act, the mandate was for a reduction level in both particulate matter and in NOx emissions. The EPA didn't mandate how that was to be accomplished, right? They just sort of laid out that it had to be done. Now, if you go back, this will probably generate some strong feelings here when I say this, this word here. When you go back to the MaxForce engine, they tried to do emissions control without using the SCR and DEF systems. We see what happened there as well. And they were able to try to do that because their feeling was we could control to the mandated levels without actually using an SCR or DEF system. So the control is there for a pollution level, but there's certainly not a preference for one system over another. Now, all the heavy duty trucking has gone to using these DEF and SCR systems, so really across the board, frankly, because they're effective. Now, they're effective at reducing the NOx emissions. They are certainly not without their challenges as well. Sort of an interesting story, when you start to think about why the system's designed the way it is, it wasn't a brand new technology for trucking. There was a push, as you came out of the 90s for clean coal, right? As coal was really coming back or trying to remain in favor from power generation for stationary power plants, there was all this talk of clean coal. there's not some magical coal that we're mining, right? All clean coal technology really was putting particulate matter filters and a similar NOx scrubber system directly onto the power plants themselves from those coal burners. The only difference between that technology there and what's on heavy duty trucking is on the power plant side, they use ammonia. They inject that directly into that exhaust stream over a catalyst. It wouldn't necessarily be very safe to be running trucks with ammonia tanks directly on them. And then you would get into issues of, bridges, tunnels where you can't necessarily be carrying. So what they realized was we can use DEF. In this case, it's, the material DEF, it's just diesel emissions fluid. It's a aqueous solution of urea. And what happens is urea, it's relatively harmless. It's caustic, so it breaks down the system over time, but it's harmless. But at high temperature in the exhaust stream, it near immediately actually breaks down to ammonia. And so to the question of what's the purpose of DEF, it is the fluid, right, that generates ammonia, which is the catalyst for the reaction itself. There's a chemical reaction that happens in the exhaust stream at the SCR itself, which is a catalyst. And it does that to convert NOx, which is a primary pollutant. It's the primary cause of smog and acid rain. It's, a contributor to cardiovascular disease, asthma, et cetera. And it converts that NOx emissions into just nitrogen, which is one of the most common, gases in the air we breathe anyway, totally harmless, and a non-pollutant. The systems themselves, while they're effective, can certainly be failure prone. I mean, let's be honest here. We're talking about an exhaust stream that can be, at very, very high temperatures, up to 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on where you are in the exhaust stream. That temperature fluctuation can be very high. You've got multiple different materials, right? The DEF pumps, the pump itself's got plastics and rubber gaskets. And like I said, the DEF itself is caustic. And then your sensors and everything plugs into this exhaust stream directly where you've got soot and exhaust and high temperatures. And God forbid you have a coolant leak upstream, that's flowing down here as well. So it certainly is a lot more challenging to maintain. But I think it's important to understand it's not just the DEF system we've got to maintain. It's more critical than ever that we maintain the entire vehicle. So the days of carrying around a jug of coolant and just topping off your coolant every once in a while because you've got a leak somewhere, unfortunately, those days really are gone because that coolant now, instead of just working its way through the tailpipe, it's getting there through other stuff. It's going to plug up your DPF itself. I certainly understand where the frustration is,
right.
But I don't think it's in the material itself.
Right. So, okay, I think it was a lot. So I want to break that down. So number one, the government mandated a reduction in emissions, especially nitrous oxide. That was the big one that they were targeting. So that's what the government mandated. They didn't tell the manufacturers how to get there. So the government is responsible for the mandate to reduce emissions. The manufacturers are responsible for the systems that were produced. So we need to keep those two things separate in our mind. Although there is a correlation, the system that got generated is not directly mandated by the government. So when you have an issue with something in your diesel emission system, yes, in a macro level, the government mandated the change, but it's really the designers of the system that were like, okay, how are we going to do this? They came up with this technology and it is what it is. One thing you mentioned is you were talking about the relatively harmless diesel emissions fluid or DEF fluid. I've heard people say that all the vegetation on the sides of the highways are now dead because of DEF fluid. Is that a myth?
That's definitely a myth.
Okay, because the actual composition of DEF fluid is not toxic or caustic.
Correct. And if you've got a leak, right, if you were actually leaking DEF fluid, DEF is used at a quite low rate as compared to actual diesel, right? So it's a relatively small tank, you're not filling it up every time you fill up your diesel tank either. So you can imagine there's a very low amount of DEF actually moving through the system. So if you had a leak that were causing it to leak into the environment, you would know because you'd be, out of DEF fluid immediately. And that'll shut your truck down, right? There's a sensor that's checking the fluid level in your DEF tank. And if that's low, right, that's going to ultimately eventually put you into
okay.
D-rate.
Right.
And even some of the systems, if it's throwing too much DEF and then, going out through the truck, depending on the manufacturer, some of the systems actually have a sensor to pick up additional ammonia at the end of the system to reduce the rate that it's putting DEF in. so that it doesn't have any additional material coming out of the tailpipe emissions.
Okay, and the second part of this myth about the fact that the truck manufacturers made the DES system to not work on purpose. Now, we can't speak for the truck OEMs, but you work for a manufacturer. Is that real? I worked for a manufacturer. I'm going to tell you my experience in a minute, but from your perspective, do you think that that makes any sense at all, that a truck OEM would actually make a system that doesn't work on purpose just to screw over their customers?
It's the same kind of myth I think you hear of, in your phone, you're going to put out software updates that are going to intentionally make your iPhone become, or, whatever your phone device is, obsolete and slow to get you to buy a new one. I don't believe, and again, you're right, Jamie, I can't speak for the OEMs, right? So I don't believe that anybody out there is doing it inherently to just generate a spend. And frankly, if one OEM were, you'd think from a competitive advantage reason, another OEM would go make a better system and market that, right? And say, hey, buy our truck because we won't have,
we don't do that.
Much. Correct. And they would be very aggressive on that marketing campaign. I think the reality, what happens is with the OEMs, I think, and again, this is just my opinion, what I think the OEMs are really doing is focusing on their primary customer, which for a lot of the North American market is a sort of a tier one type fleet that's using a vehicle for a certain period of time, and then often selling that asset, anywhere between year, let's call it like 3 and 6. And when you look at most of these systems, the high primary failure rates, and the DEF supply model is a great example. The primary failure time usually is occurring at about year 7 to 10. So the first owner of these vehicles is minimizing their maintenance on the after treatment system itself. But then when you get into the second, third, and owner operator, the systems themselves now are starting to have their first failure, but the truck itself is also aging. So while a DEF pump may have lasted 7 to 10 years the first time, if some of the failure was because you had a mild oil leak causing additional soot and oil to flow through the system, if you haven't caught that and actually changed and repaired the system upstream, when you replace that DEF pump, the replacement part isn't going to last nearly as long. And these, I think that's starting to become pretty clear, right? Total maintenance of your vehicle is critical. And as the vehicle ages, right, like anything, maintenance expense, what it's going to take to maintain that vehicle is only going to increase. And this is a brand new system, right? We go back to 2010 is the first time that these systems really started. So those trucks are just 11, 12 years old now, really into that prime replacement age as we speak. And it's a spend from a maintenance perspective that nobody had before. So I can certainly understand where that feeling comes from, but directly answer your question, no, my opinion, right, speaking of just my experience, is that this is not intentional just to get, cash. This is the OEMs complying with the mandates that are out there to have these emissions control devices.
Yeah, as someone who worked for a manufacturer at one point in my career as well, I've just never seen a manufacturer go out of their way. You bring up the cell phone issue and what seems like planned obsolescence inside of our devices. But, one thing people don't know is they don't know that there's something like 300,000 new viruses that are made. I can't remember if that's daily or weekly or what the interval was, but it's some ridiculous number that are produced. And the manufacturers of these devices are constantly having to do major updates just to keep up with some of the security risks attached to the use of that device. So does that mean every couple of years your phone probably it needs to be upgraded? Yeah. Is that the manufacturer of the phone's fault? No, not really. It's actually the people who are trying to take advantage of those systems. We have a situation where our society has told our representatives that we want action on emissions. We want action on what is perceived to be the cause of climate change. And therefore, the government has come along and said, you've got to do this, trucking industry. And the truck manufacturers had to respond. So I know that probably doesn't ease the pain of some of the listeners who are facing these costs that they've never had to deal with before. But the reality is that's just the way it is. It's not because of the government or because of a truck manufacturer trying to screw you over specifically. It's just the nature of the beast of what we're dealing with in this issue. So that moves me on to the second myth, though, because it's like, okay, fine. Even if a truck owner says, you know what, Daniel, you know what, Jamie, I accept everything you just said. I get it. Thanks for clarifying that first myth. Myth number 2, the best solution is to delete your diesel emission system. Now, my own father-in-law believes this. He's told me in the past, like all of their pickup trucks, they have a water well drilling company. All their pickup trucks, they've had trouble with it. All of their big Class 8 trucks, they've had trouble. And he knows that it's not the right choice, but he just sometimes thinks, I think we should just delete this because I cannot get this thing to work properly. Jason G, he says, I deleted my DEF, DPF, and EGR crap on my 2022 Pete. It was a Model 389, 2 days after I bought it. No issues or breakdowns for me, and an extra 1.5 miles per gallon fuel efficiency. Optiboli says cat loaders are unusable with all the pump issues unless you rip it all off. And user 677-394-7705617 says a delete is like $3,000 to $4,000. No brainer for a delete when it's off warranty. So this is a big range of opinions. You've got someone who bought a brand new truck, deleted it 2 days later. Someone who says, wait till the warranty's off. And then you've got other people that are stuck in the middle, like even my father-in-law, who knows it's not the right choice, but is sometimes tempted to do it. So what do you have to say about this? Should people be deleting these systems?
Well, look, I mean, obviously, I'm never going to say, and not because it's a cash grab for us either, right? But because of just, the reality of what the law is, right? I'm never going to say, yes, you should delete it.
Yeah, it's illegal.
Right, it's illegal, right?
Yeah.
And there's not only financial, but there's criminal penalties as well. These are mandated emissions control devices. It's against the law. There's both financial and criminal penalties to change the emissions control devices in any way from the way they were designed and built from the OEM. Now, one of the things I will say to that as a caveat is the EPA has been very clear, and all enforcement action is very clear, that the goal is to enforce people that are attempting to deviate from the emissions control devices working the way they're supposed to. There is no intent to go after anybody that are trying to sell or make available replacement parts to make it easier or more affordable to repair and maintain these systems.
So when you say that, what you mean is, I want to make sure I understand this just in case there's confusion. What you're saying is that if somebody came along with a enhancement in the aftermarket to one of these systems that was able to clearly show it wasn't trying to get around these emission standards, it was actually just trying to make a better mousetrap, that would be okay?
So we walk sort of a very fine line here. If we're trying to say make the part more durable, right, so that the part maybe eliminates the failure mode, but is functioning exactly the same. But we're not going to modify the emission system in terms of how it functions, even if it were to still comply with the emissions regulations.
So deleting it is modifying it at the maximum level because you're ripping the whole thing out and you're trying to go around it. So that is where we have gotten, if you do that, it's illegal and it's not recommended.
Right. And on top of that, to go back to Jason G's comments, right, he took a brand new truck that's 2 days old that has probably a 3-year, warranty on it. And that's certainly not covered by any warranty now. Plus it's a, ticking time bomb from any kind of, criminal or civilian penalties from doing so, for modifying. But we will, go back and see, like when we did the DEF modules on the remanufacture, if we could improve any of the kind of failure components internal to make them more durable, to make the product last longer, we'll look at doing that. But the way the pump works itself, the way the system works, we're not changing any of that. If you were to create a knock sensor that, somehow is, better technology, it's more durable, that would be a great, and there'd be no enforcement on it. But if you're creating a knock sensor that has software on it that's designed to just cheat the system, no, that's illegal and will certainly come with its own ramifications.
I was just going to say enforcement is an issue here because like in Canada, certainly in the States, from what I've heard, the enforcement is much more stringent than in Canada. It seems like in Canada, we have all the laws, the same laws, but the actual enforcement is lacking. And therefore, it's kind of like everything is legal unless you get caught. So in Canada, I think people are more bold about deleting their systems than in the States because of enforcement. But regardless, in both countries, the laws are pretty much the same, which is it is illegal to do this.
Yeah, I can't speak to Canada enforcement, but I'll say on the U.S. side, I mean, and you can go on, just Google like EPA, DEF enforcement or anything like that, and you'll see EPA actually publishes a website of all their enforcement actions. And there's been a lot of focus, especially on manufacturers or resellers of parts designed to cheat these systems. But there's also been plenty of enforcement against fleets, et cetera, who have either been importing illegal vehicles or modifying vehicles to not comply with with those emissions requirements. And actually, just I want to say it was last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a pretty big announcement of someone that now actually included criminal penalties. And there was a year in prison based on selling parts to take light duty diesel trucks. These are mostly diesel pickup trucks, and modify them to delete the DPFs, EGRs, and SCR systems. And it was a repeat offender. I'll sort of leave it there. You can go out and find it. There was a pretty big announcement, but it's an issue here too, right? I mean, the EPA estimates, I think from that article, about 500,000 vehicles are out there that do not comply. And as we go forward into the future, I only expect that enforcement, at least here in the U.S., to get more stringent because, again, you're talking about pollutants that are the primary cause of smog, of acid rain. It's shown to be a precursor for asthma and cardiovascular disease. These are primary pollutants. And, as a father of young kids, I understand why we want cleaner air. I appreciate it. I also, appreciate the difficulty of maintaining these systems. Then like this is the shameless plug side here, right? So this is one of the reasons why Dorman and companies like Diesel Laptops are so in front of this, trying to make it clear to the end user, whether it's fleets or owner operators, they can look up the repair themselves. They can diagnose the cause of the fault. They can do the upstream diagnostics as well to find the root cause of their problems. And they can go to the aftermarket and buy the parts. You don't have to go back to the dealer. This is a spend that didn't exist about 10 years ago. And for a lot of fleets, we get it, right? We're talking about the number one spend now, right there with diesel and tires, right? Diesel's probably a little higher right now with the current environment. But in general, you take a spend that didn't exist 10 years ago and it's now a number one spend, that's a huge pain point. And about 95 to 97% of that spend is estimated to be back at the dealer. And so it is, I think, really prudent on fleets and owner operators to learn that they can do the diagnostics themselves here. They can understand these systems. Once you understand something, it's easy to do the work on it. And the parts are available. And that book of parts is expanding really rapidly here as everybody works to try to increase the amount of parts to service the owner operators and the fleets out there with these vehicles as they age.
Okay, so don't delete. It's illegal. It's a bad idea. Don't delete, but get educated about how these systems work. Expand your knowledge about that. Make sure that you're maintaining upstream, downstream, looking at the entire system, not just the diesel emission part of it, and also take advantage of the aftermarket options up to and including companies like Dorman Products that make the parts, and of course, companies like Diesel Laptops that provide you with the tools and equipment you need to do this, even if you're not a diesel technician. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Don't have a heavy-duty part number and need to look up a part? Go to parts.diesellaptops.com or download the app on Apple or Android to create your free account. Looking for high-quality fuel injection for heavy-duty applications? Having one supplier for fuel injection allows you to better serve customers by providing them with a complete line, which increases your sales and profitability. Learn more at ambackinternational.com/aftermarket. We're back from our break, and before the break, we were tackling a couple of the big myths around diesel emission systems. We've got one more, Daniel. Myth number 3, you should use water instead of your DEF fluid. Now, we've already touched on that DEF fluid is not killing the vegetation on the sides of the highways. That is a myth. Let's talk about this idea of using water. Now, Patriot Meme 2.0, what would happen if you just use water instead of DEF fluid? That was the question posed, and then there was a bunch of comments after that. Christopher Bay says, ours fails every 2 months. Steve, I think it's Tilly's 449. Why so many have been running water in place of DEF? That's my Dodge says water in the DEF tank every 3 to 4 months has kept my DEF trouble-free for over 1 million miles. Well, first of all, congratulations on 1 million miles. Whether or not the water strategy was the reason you got 1 million miles, we'll see. And Melody, and you know, she must be from a northern climate because she says DEF freezes. Tanks and lines need heaters. Some genius decided to run these heaters off of 22 gauge wire. The connectors melted. So, you know, we get a range of different things happening to people. They're having different experiences. They're coming to the conclusion that water is a good replacement. Is that a myth?
Oh, it's definitely a myth, right? And I think there's three in here. Maybe we tackle them one at a time.
Sure.
Yeah, the way the system works, there's a NOx sensor, a nitrogen oxide emission sensor, at the very end of the system, at the tailpipe, right before it leaves, you know, the exhaust stack. And that's going to pick up the actual NOx emissions coming out of the end of the system. Without the DEF itself in here, the conversion cannot happen effectively. There is a catalyst in the SCR, the selective catalytic reduction. It's sort of like a DPF or like a catalytic converter, but the efficiency is very, very low on it, right? It relies on the DEF fluid itself to make that chemical conversion from NOx to nitrogen.
Okay, so just I just want to make sure. So what we're saying is if you use water, you're putting a stress, or like you're stressing your SCR more than normal because it doesn't have that chemical reaction from the DEF fluid. Yeah,
so it's sort of two things, right? One, water's got a lot of impurities in it, right? Unless you're putting deionized water in. So you could actually be causing damage, right? As, you know, if anybody's lived in, say, a hard water climate, you know, we certainly know how, you know, shower heads get clogged up, et cetera. So you could be actually doing damage by putting any kind of impurities into the system. But the other thing is you're not going to get rid of the NOx emissions with water. It relies on the DEF itself. So this is like diagnosing from afar. My opinion is likely people saying, I just put water in my tank, have probably deleted a lot of the system, or they've probably put software in as part of a delete that says, I'm not going to look at the actual NOx emissions coming off of that NOx sensor. Because the fact is, without DEF, your NOx emissions is going to be out of compliance. It's going to be higher than the EPA mandate. And the way the trucks are designed, the way the emissions control devices are designed, if it recognizes that higher than allowed NOx emissions level, ultimately that truck is going to go into D rate. And it's going to shut you down on the side of the road.
Okay, so this is not a good strategy. You're saying that chances are, if someone has been quote unquote successfully doing this, it's because in addition to using water, they have done something else to the system to modify it so that it doesn't force the engine into D rate. And what about like my first thought as soon as I saw this, that people are putting water, is I thought, well, even if they're getting away with that somehow, it's going to freeze. Like, so, I mean, I guess if you're in the southern states and you're never going to have cold temperature, you'd be okay. But the minute you head up to the Rockies or come up north here, you're going to have an issue right away. So to me, this is just going to do more damage than it's worth.
Again, unless you've deleted the system, right? Unless you have done things to make either the vehicle not look at the system, or you've got, you know, parts deleted and software to change how it's going to look at it, it's a bad idea all around. And again, deleting the system is a bad idea all around as well. And if you ever go to bring it back into compliance, you've likely damaged a lot of these very expensive components, right? You think the heated lines and the DEF pumps and the injectors are expensive. That's nothing compared to replacing the actual SCR itself. So, you know, unfortunately, you know, it's like the old adage, a stitch in time saves nine here. You know, the less we do, the damage that can happen, the incremental cost gets really expensive really quickly. Not to say that the maintenance expense itself is inexpensive as well, but the pain's going to get a lot worse.
Pay me now or pay me later, right?
Yeah, pay me a lot later, exactly.
Yeah.
And on the freezing side, yeah, you're right. But I will say, like, DEF also does have issues in cold weather climates. So in addition to the potential for freezing, sort of what happens first is it crystallizes. And those crystals are pretty sharp and they cause all kind of problems. So you can get clogged lines, you can get damage to gaskets and seals and injectors. So the one user that was mentioning, the problems in cold climates with heated lines, et cetera, that's true. And we actually see some seasonality in cold weather climates to failures because the system may seem like it's working fine in the summer. The heating elements, all those other important components might have broken, but the system's not trying to turn it on. So most vehicles have an ambient temperature sensor somewhere, right? Usually involved in the engine to optimize how the engine efficiency is, recognizing the ambient air temperature coming into the engine. And the systems will pick that up and say, hey, if I'm below freezing, I'm going to turn on these heaters. And then if those heaters don't work because, they've broken or they burned out or a connector's melted out, then in that case, right, the system's going to throw codes and say, hey, there's something I've got to fix. A lot of patents around those systems. So we continue to try to work to make more and more of those parts available in the aftermarket. But yes, there is challenges with cold weather climates, but emissions control is important in all climates as well. And frankly, smog is, you get these inversion layers in the wintertime. And in a lot of ways, smog is even a bigger challenge in cold weather climates and cold weather times. So it's a fair point that the challenge sort of props up here. In cold weather, the systems do have, either running off the engine coolant or running off electric heaters inside the pumps and the tanks and the lines up to the injectors. And they can be failure prone as well. But again, I think the aftermarket's going to react to try to make as many of those parts available. And companies, again, like Diesel Laptops are out there trying to make the diagnostics as available as possible so you don't have to go back to the dealer just to find out the cause of the problem.
So we've tackled 3 big myths around diesel emission systems. Daniel, what is the main takeaway listeners need to remember when they are maintaining and operating trucks with diesel emission systems?
I think for me, the big takeaway is education and knowledge. And maybe that's become a bit of a refrain here in the industry, but it's true and it's critical. Once you understand the systems, like truly understand them, it becomes a bit of a logical play, right? I'm seeing this happen downstream. I should look for these things upstream. If I'm seeing a lot of soot or I'm seeing, a lot of material on my sensors downstream, then I need to look upstream in the system at the engine. Do I have a coolant leak somewhere? Do I have an oil leak? What's causing this failure downstream? And getting educated in tools. Again, we talked about Diesel Laptops. This has products out there, as well as others. Understanding what is available and that you can do the diagnostic work yourself and the replacement work yourself. These parts don't require reprogramming. You're not at risk of enforcement if you're using legitimate parts, even in the aftermarket, to do replacement and repairs and maintenance on the systems. They are maintainable. Almost all of this is all plug and play, but that just takes education and knowledge to understand, how the systems work. How do I diagnose challenges and problems? And how do I do the actual maintenance repairs myself?
This has been a really great conversation, Daniel. I think I want to conclude myself by saying that I understand why some people have kind of believed some of these myths and how they have experienced financial pain related to maintaining and repairing these systems. We get that, and we're not trying to be in any way insensitive to that, but you can actually make things a lot worse if you fall prey to some of these myths. So I'm glad that we were able to debunk them, give people some good quality information. You've been listening to the Heavy Duty Parts Report. I'm your host, Jamie Irvin, and we've been speaking with Daniel Simon from Dorman Products. To learn more about Dorman Products, visit dormanhdsolutions.com. Links are in the show notes. All the way from Brazil today, Daniel, thank you so much for being on the Heavy Duty Parts Report once again.
Thanks, Jamie. Like I said, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you for watching this video. Click here to subscribe to the Heavy Duty Parts Report YouTube channel, and click here to watch another great episode.